Good afternoon from Rio de Janeiro. Good evening in Europe, and it's the middle of the night in Australia.
Early morning, 3 o'clock.
Early morning. So this is the fifth joint session of Making Sense of the Post-COVID World, Continuities and Changes. This is an international lecture series convened by Sergio Costa from Freie University Berlin, Wolfgang Nobel from the University of Hamburg, and José Mauricio Domingues and myself from the Institute of Social and Political Studies in Rio de Janeiro. Today we welcome as our guest Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty from the University of Chicago. He has kindly agreed to join us to discuss what he calls the Earth ethic. And Sergio Costa will make further intros, and then I'll be back here to mediate the Q&A. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Chakrabarty.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you also from my side. And just a short correction. Wolfgang Nobel is from the Hamburg Institute for Social Research, not from the University of Hamburg.
Not that important, but
yeah, not that important. Yeah.
No, I usually just say from Hamburg. So like today that everything's so formal, I'm sorry.
Since he's the director of the institution, so it's perhaps quite fine to mention this. So Dipesh Chakrabarty is Lawrence A. Kimpton Distinguished Service Professor in History, South Asian Language and Civilization at the University of Chicago. He is a founding member of the editorial collective of Subaltern Studies, a founding editor of Postcolonial Studies, and has served as the editorial boards of the American Historical Review and Public Culture. Among his really numerous publications, I would like to highlight his influential book, Provincializing Europe, Postcolonial Thought and Historical Difference, published in 2000. Which systematized the results of his research in the field of postcolonial studies and global history by exploring how not primarily Europe, but the entanglements between the different world regions have shaped modernity. This book has really decisively contributed to redesign entire disciplines such as global history, but also global sociology. More recently, Professor Chakrabarty has dedicated to study climate change and the anthropogenic transformation of the planet, including, of course, the assessment of the epistemological, moral, and political implications of these changes. The book, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, published in 2021, that we will discuss in this session, offers a encompassing assessment of Professor Chakrabarty's findings in this field. So thank you very much again, Professor Chakrabarty, to join us today for this Q&A session. I'd like to start with the first question, and permit to start with a quite general question to better understand the making of the book and your own trajectory from subaltern postcolonial studies and global history to planetary and Earth ethics. You state in one of your theses in the first chapter that it's necessary to connect global history of capitalism with the species history of humans. But at the same time, you seem to reject the concept of Capitalocene, which tries exactly to combine these two histories. So if you look back, do you think that the interpretations of the history of capitalism and of humans as species are adequately combined and discussed in this book? Could you please perhaps give us some insights how these two histories and historiographies can be connected? And perhaps a related question, what at least for me it's not that clear in the book, is there a third layer, which is the history of the planet, or our planet's history and our histories as a species merged in your analytical approach? So sorry for this broad question, but it's just to start the discussion. Yeah.
No, thank you. Thank you. When I actually started working on this project, and when I first published my essay on the four theses, which became the first chapter in the book, that's when I got a lot of criticism from people who were independently developing the idea of of capitalism, or plantationocene, or econocene, or so they criticized me for, in their view, for making all of humanity, the species, look responsible for climate change because of the fact, which actually I had acknowledged, that per capita emissions were very different from one place to another. And the fact also is that about 12 nations emit the bulk of the emissions, India and China included. So why would one blame the whole species for that? Was the argument. And for a while, I was also trying to answer these charges. In the book, the reason why I did not put Anthropocene in the title of the book was that as my thinking progressed, I realized that debate was being framed very much as an either-or question. Because the question is, even if you argued that capitalism had caused all the environmental problems, or most of the environmental problems we face now, planetary problems, in order to understand what the problems were, you'd actually have to go beyond political economy and learn something about Earth system science, learn something about the history of evolution on the planet, learn something about the past great extinctions, if you have to understand what it means to have a great extinction. So whether you call it capitalocene, or whether you call it Anthropocene or something else, what became clear to me is that human beings, internally differentiated through their institutions, are affecting planetary processes which have been around for a long time. So for instance, the long in human terms, like let's say the cycle of ice age, then an interglacial warm period, then another ice age. I mean, even that cycle is a few million years old, so long in human terms. But some people argue that we have already fended off the next possible ice age by thousands of years. Some say tens of thousands of years. So my point is that and this is something which affects all of us. So one point was that the theoretical tools of analyzing capitalism, or conceptual tools, now had to be supplemented by tools that came from Earth system science, tools that came from evolutionary biology, tools that came from physics or chemistry. And in that sense, just as Franz Fanon had once said in talking about the third world, he said every term in Marxism has to be stretched when you take it to the colony. Similarly, you have to stretch your knowledge of political economy to connect it with these other knowledge systems. That was one thing. So that's why I argued that we have become planetary. Whether you blame capitalism, whether you blame something else, or you cannot. Today's reality is that we are having to think about planetary processes which we normally didn't think about. Even Marxists did not before. And the second point was that, see, in the social sciences, including in Marxist social science, every problem we think about ultimately relates to human experience of the world. and the prospects of there being a more just society or an egalitarian society or a fairer society, but human beings are at the center of the analysis. Whereas when you read Earth system science, the history becomes deep history. First of all, you read about the great oxidation event. So you learn to think about when did the air begin to have more oxygen in it, and you learn about the role of very ancient bacteria, algae, in producing more oxygen through photosynthesis, and the way in which oxygen, being a poisonous gas, actually killed off many forms of life or drove them underground, the nitrogen fixing bacteria, for instance. So suddenly your vision of the history expands, and you realize that Earth system science, what is interesting about the science behind climate change, is that it does not refer only to human experience in its planetary thinking. It refers to the role of the deep oceans in maintaining the climate system of the planet. It refers to the role of that the glaciers might play, that the Siberian permafrost plays. So it is a science. It gives you a sense of history which decenters the human. And in that sense, this planetary thinking is very different from, say, Indian astrology, which is planetary thinking but human indexed, or even the planetary thinking of the navigators who thousands of years ago settled in the Pacific Islands, who looked at the night sky in order to navigate. So it's not that humans have not thought about the planet before. I mean, we are planetary. But this science, as it developed, now created a system of thinking which decentered the human. So in the end, I ended up saying that whether you think through capitalism, whether you think through neoliberal capitalism, or whether you think as a capitalist, most thought in the social sciences are human-centered. Whereas when you are confronted with the planetary, you're also confronting with human thoughts. These are thought by humans, but that thoughts that decenter the human, because they tell stories that happen over such a long period of time. And humans come so late in those stories that geology and evolutionary biology necessarily decenter the human. You cannot tell that story. It's a human-told story, but you cannot put humans at the center of the story. Whereas in the story of capitalism, humans are at the center of the story. That's why that is more the story of the globe as we have made it, while I think of the planet as standing in for a different vision of history and the past. So I would say that in the end, I was not pursuing the debate about what to call it.
If you permit me a follow-up question, because you
Sure.
mentioned also that indigenous philosophies, also cosmologies, also connect these two histories in a certain way. And this was also one of our questions, because if you look at some indigenous philosophies, you see exactly what you called in your, I guess, in the introduction of the book, the consciousness of this sort of double time, the Jetztzeiten, as you mentioned in the book, and
Right.
also in German. So some indigenous philosophers, they are exactly calling our attention to this sort of living in two different times, the time of our concrete action in the planetary time. Therefore, my question would be, do you plan to integrate a more intensive dialogue with indigenous philosophies into your discussions of not only Anthropocene, but also the planetary ethics? And this has actually two motivations. The first one is a cognitive motivation, because this sort of combination of two different times are explicitly also in this sort of philosophies. And at the same time, if you look at the political agency, they are, I guess, the indigenous movements are necessary allies in constructing an idea, a more concrete idea of planetary ethics. Therefore, my question would be, how do you see these possibilities, the potentials of a dialogue with indigenous movements and also indigenous philosophies?
So again, first of all, let me just say up front that I think there's a lot to learn from indigenous philosophies. But I think I would underline philosophies because the indigenous group I know best, not that I know them very well, but the group that I've read about most are the Australian Aboriginal people. Because I've lived in Australia, I was a student here, I taught here, and that's where most of my engagement has been with indigenous philosophy, with indigenous points of view. And there's a lot to learn from them. I mean, and then there's the indigenous people in North America, in Latin America, and also in India and other places. So there's a lot to learn from these societies, I have no doubt. First of all, see, even if you come to peasant societies, so if you come to any society that you might regard as pre-modern, where people depend on the seasons, where life depends on seasons and what the earth produces in different seasons, and you do not build all-weather roads, you do not have mangoes all through the year. When you have that, so even in a peasant society, there is a sense of relationality. There's a sense that things are connected, that we depend on certain things that the planet does. And secondly, this is more prominent in indigenous societies, but you see it even in peasant societies. The non-human figures more prominently in stories, in legends, so the relationship between human and non-human is always upfront. I mean, when Durkheim was, as you know, writing about religion and was looking at ancient religions, and he was looking a lot at Australian Aboriginal societies and what European colonizers were finding out. I mean, one of the points he made about totemism is that the totem always signifies an identity that is not completely human. That involves, there's a lot to learn from all of these things. But having said that, the distinction is that when I say planet, and I have said it in the book in several points, my planet is really what Earth system scientists call the Earth system. So it is not a planet I see. See, there is a kind of, I mean, Canberra is very good for actually, the sky is so unpolluted and clear that you can sometimes see the galaxy, our own galaxy. So there is a way in which you can look at the world and a sense of cosmology and a sense of this planet can come to you. And even when you don't think about it, like if you fly one way, you get jet lag when you fly in the direction in which the Earth is spinning. If you fly the other way, you get a different kind of jet lag. The very fact that your muscles exist in the way they depends on gravity. So there are very many ways that we are off the planet. Comes to us even before we encountered Earth system science. So I think any culture, honestly, I would say, whether it's Western culture or indigenous culture, any culture has planetary kind of thinking. Because any culture has a long past. You have only been, I mean, Latour says we've never been modern, but even if you said we've only been modern for 500 years or 200 years, it's not like human beings haven't had histories before then. even in the West. So there are accretions of those histories. So I would say any culture has a sense of planetarity, that we are of this planet and we depend on seasons. It's only in the last 200 years gradually that we have lost a sense of the seasons. I mean, one of the things that the British built in India, the first innovation they made, was to build what they called all-weather roads. Because all the wars before the British came depended on the seasons. You could not cross a river in certain seasons. You couldn't fight. You had to stop fighting. You could not pass on certain roads because of rain and mud. You had to stop fighting. The Europeans built the capacity, so all-weather ships that could actually go in the storm and weather storm better. I mean, these are the capacities that modern technology built. But the distinguishing feature of Earth system science as my planet, as I said, this planet is not a result of human experience of it, because it is a product of modern technology. So for instance, to argue, so the same technology, Paul Crutzen actually put the irony of it very well in an interview. Paul Crutzen said, the same technology that is destroying the planet allowed us to know certain truths about this planet, its entanglement. So, for instance, to argue that the present warming of the planet is something that the planet has not seen for 800,000 years, so long before there were Homo sapiens, you can't go back to human experience. So you go back to ancient air that is trapped in old ice in the polar caps. So how do you get ancient air? You drill. Where does the drilling technology come from? It comes from the gas companies and the oil companies, right? Modified for drilling ice. So in a peculiar way, you could say that even Western technology and modernity that was premised on a nature-culture separation, as Latour would say, or Philippe Descola would say, at the end of the day, it is actually the story it is telling is not of separation. I mean, Earth system science is also telling us the story about entanglement, with the difference that Earth system science incorporates the role that deep oceanic currents might play. And because, as you know, I mean, this is Carl Schmitt's argument, the deep ocean was explored only with the kind of shipping technology that the West built in building empires. So I would say that there's an interesting difference, an important difference between the planet conceived as a system, a scientific concept, and the planet conceived in indigenous societies or in Indian astrology. I mean, I'm sure all agricultural people have these sayings, but in Bengal, where I come from, there are distinct sayings about when to sow, when to reap, when to harvest, traditional, and all these societies are extremely season conscious. So this, and the second thing I want to say is also that if you look at the history of settler colonialism, where Europeans actually settled, and because my bread and butter is Indian history, I can say this. In Indian history, this question always comes up: why didn't the Europeans settle here? Because actually around 1816, a very quote-unquote forward-looking Indian man called Ram Mohan Roy, whose 250th year we are celebrating in India, he went to England, died in England, 1830. But he was very interested in the independence of Latin American countries. In the early 19th century, Argentina becomes independent in 1816, that particular year. And he was hoping that Europeans would settle in India in the same way that they were settling in Latin America, create a mestizo class, marry our people, and help us become modern. So in Indian history, this question comes up: why did Europeans not settle in India? That's because Europeans thought India was already crowded. Even though Indian population has grown 4 times in my lifetime, But even the 200 million or 250 million that Europeans found in India, they thought this place is already crowded. We don't want to settle here. We want to rule, but we don't want to settle. So you see, settler colonialism happened in societies that were, in European eyes, sparsely populated. In Australia, they had this theory that this is terra nullius. Nobody lived there. They denied the existence of Aboriginal people in any meaningful sense. So the question is, in the last 70 years, since the war, one thing that has happened is human population has grown hugely. And it's now going to be 8 billion, will probably stabilize at 10. And this question comes up, can we feed 10 billion people without modern agriculture? I'm not a specialist enough in these subjects to have an answer for it. But it seems to me that this is a very important question. And while there's a lot to learn from indigenous societies, the real challenge is how do we marry what we learn from indigenous philosophies or peasant philosophies to the contemporary desires of an expanding middle class in the world, and which is also expanding exponentially. I mean, there's a German scholar, Hannes Bergthaler, who works on Asian middle class and Anthropocene. And he shows how, if you look at the consuming classes, the number of people you'll consider consumers, which is now sort of about 3-4 billion, every additional billion is added more quickly. And that, whether you like it or not, that is a fact of contemporary world. And in many ways, it's disastrous because any time that people join the middle class, they have more money, they want to eat more protein. It immediately leads to a certain kind of food industry. Whereas, Jan Jalasovic and his colleagues showed that the most populous bird on the planet is broiler chicken. 21 billion. The next naturally populous bird, the next most naturally populous, is 1.5 billion. But when you have so many people wanting to eat well, and you can't deny, see, on grounds of justice, you can't say to them, okay, we have eaten well now, but you can't eat well. And so this is where this question of how do you help so many people survive and have intrahuman justice, but marry it at the same time to our planetary concerns. Whether you come from earth system science, whether you come from indigenous society, that is the crucial question for me.
José Mauricio, would you like to ask the next question? Thank you so much.
Yes, I really appreciate your answer because you're avoiding a sort of the trap of a dichotomy and looking straight into the face of modernity and the demands that real people have in the world without jetsoning all the things that we may take into account in order to frame our answers to the, let's say, climate emergency we're going through now. But actually, the question I had to put to you is more related to the role of the state, because chapter, your former articles and the lectures, what comes up is capitalism. Of course, capitalism is very important, and I agree with you as well, because it's we can't separate the trajectory of the species, the evolution of the species, from its specific manifestations or embodiments or whatever. So the bourgeoisie is not something external to the human species. That would be a very strange sort of argument. Yeah. Although, of course, you have to see different responsibilities in historical and geographical terms.
Sure.
But I would like to hear you, because that interests me very much in terms of my own work, how you place the state, the modern state, within this development of humanity and our relation to nature, especially emergence of modernity, which I would say is more at the end of the 8th century. I'm a bit traditional in this regard, but that's how I see it. But,
yeah. No, thank you, and thank you for appreciating the fact that even the worst capitalist is part of the human species, and shares our characteristics. But and the species flourishing can actually entail development of inequality. One could argue that inequality, a capitalist form of inequality, has also helped us to go to this number, and the fact that everybody lives longer now compared to where humans were before, say, let's say antibiotics were invented or penicillin was invented. Coming to your question of the state, the state, I think, is both. I mean, the state is an inevitable player. So the world, since the setting up of the United Nations, the most global organization we have is the United Nations. And it was set up as a forum where states would come and bargain over things. And as I say in the book, the assumption was that human beings have indefinite amount of time at their disposal. So the example I give is the Israel-Palestine. So if you look at UN resolutions in US-Palestine, you know, they number so many because we assume there's a problem. At some point of time it will be solved, but we don't know when. So when the first indication of modern climate problem came to everybody, which was the discovery of a hole in the ozone layer, the way the world dealt with it was through the United Nations. So nations came together and set up what was known as the Montreal Protocol. And we were lucky that dealing with the ozone layer became a technical question. So you could change the propellant in a canister and at least deal with that problem, or think that you're dealing with this problem. When it came to climate change, when scientists were saying we are warming up the planet, the nations followed the model of the Montreal Protocol to set up IPCC and the Kyoto Protocol. And the IPCC has become a bargaining forum. Scientists say something, the nations bargain over it. So in some ways, states are a practical agency through which we've been working. But the IPCC process also shows how inadequate the states are. And when you look at actual states, I mean, the war in Ukraine reminds you again, modern states are habituated to give geopolitics more importance than other aspects of geo, like global warming or problems that may affect all. And the example I give often of this problem are the Himalayas. So there are 8 or 9 rivers that come from the Himalayas. The main product for humans of those mountain range is water, not apples and other things. And these rivers actually serve a number of countries from Pakistan to Vietnam. The glaciers, but these glaciers are completely nationalized. India and China are always ready to fight a war on the mountains. Pakistan too. So the Himalayas have become the most militarized mountain range in the world. But what we need, clearly, we need a multilateral authority. I'm not saying global authority, but even multilateral, of the countries involved, an agency that will maintain the health of those glaciers, because the glaciers are receding. So I think that while the nation states are a practical reality and we work through them, the climate crisis also shows how increasingly inadequate our model of global management that we set up after the Second World War through UN is. So So I think of states, nation states, as a structure that is falling short of what we need to do to address the climate problem. But at the same time, the reasons why nations want to have nation state are not all extinguished. And we still live in times when, within India, for instance, in the Kashmir question, there are so many areas where, in the Ukraine question, so many areas where people actually want a nation state, that their sense of freedom and autonomy is still the one practical way they think it's going to be worked out is through the nation, through acquiring a form of a state. So I think that the political thought that has guided us since the Second World War and before is inadequate for meeting the challenge of the climate change, which actually requires us to come together and address the calendars, what I call the calendars of definite time, that even IPCC gives. So when IPCC says humans have only 2030, by which time to, let's say, emit so much carbon. This is your carbon budget. So the IPCC gives us carbon budget for the whole world. That's because for the IPCC, the planet is one. But nations bargain and fight over those calendars. So India might say to the West, you guys deal with this for 20 years. I need to burn coal because my people are poor. So we split the planet. So the IPCC thinks of it as one planet. And the politics of the nation states are splitting the planet. And to say, look, the planet is your concern, not mine now. I need to develop. So that makes the politics of addressing climate change very, very difficult. Because politics is founded on the idea of difference. Whereas the science of climate change is constantly positing one Earth system. They even don't say Earth systems, they say Earth system in the singular. And this is a major problem, and I don't have a way of seeing around it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again. Wolfgang?
Yes, thanks a lot for this last answer. I would like to go into a little bit of a different direction with my question. I mean, I completely agree, and I'm completely convinced that the kind of a planetary historiography or planetary sociology really decenters our perspectives, that humanity and human beings are decentered, so it will help us a lot, in a sense, maybe to solve problems we probably couldn't solve if we would have a different perspective. So that's one point, and I'm really convinced about that. The other question is, what does this kind of a planetary sociology or history do to the conventional matrix of the disciplines?
Yeah.
Disciplines like the humanities on the one side and the sciences on the other side. Maybe I don't see it in Dipesh Chakrabarty, but when I read, for example, Big History by David Christian or so,
yeah,
my concern would be, why should I teach my students or my pupils about the history of the Earth from a sociological or historic perspective if the scientists can do it probably much better?
yeah.
So my question would be, aren't we in a kind of a danger to give way to a rather, I don't know how to say, but maybe if I say it ugly, to a rather positivistic understanding of the world, because in a way we are giving up a lot of our competence as historians or as a sociologist and give the natural scientists a lot of saying about things we really do not understand. Do you see that there's a kind of a change coming in the disciplinary matrix as well?
Yeah, I think so. I agree with you completely on the legitimacy of the question. And the way I deal with it is by philosophically taking human experience of the world seriously. We know that there are many physical facts about the world that scientists talk about that we don't experience. We don't experience electromagnetic waves around us. We don't hear ultrasonic sound. The range of colors we see is limited. There are many other colors that you could see. So, but there's in fact, there's a German philosopher of the mind called Thomas Metzinger, who has a very interesting book called, in English, it's called The Ego Tunnel, basically arguing that humans have a tunnel vision of reality. If we could see everything that scientists talk about, this world would look very different. But the point is that we have a tunnel vision that constitutes our phenomenology. It is through that tunnel vision we fall in love, we go to war, we bring up children, everything we do, everything that, I would say from Kant on through to Heidegger, we've philosophized. And I think that has to be at the center of the enterprise, so that decentering ourselves is not a question of forgetting that it is our experience of the world that is at the root of all the human institutions. So see, therefore I have a slight difference from friends from whose work I've learned a lot, like even Bruno Latour or Donna Haraway or all these people who think that one day there may be a realm of politics that involves both the humans and the non-human, and among the non-human, the non-living as well. Now, whereas I tend to think that politics is a human vocation, as we understand it. But what we do politically can change once we are able to see ourselves from the outside, as it were. So once we are able to decenter ourselves, we may be able to change our politics. So, and the two books I use in the book too, and even in otherwise, to give the example. So these are two books that by two scientists, but which proceed from the shared assumption that humans are having a planetary impact on biodiversity loss, all of those things. And the two scientists are both based at Harvard. One of them died recently. One is Edward Wilson, the evolutionary biologist. The other one is a physicist called David Keith, who has been given money by the Gates Foundation to do research on geoengineering of the climate. And they're working on spreading aerosol sulfate in the stratosphere to reflect sunlight back. And the argument is that it will dim. If you can dim sunlight or scatter it, it will reduce warming and give us room to create other technologies. Now, right or wrong, you can see that here the project is of making ourselves even more central to the management of the planet. So if you start from the premise we are planetary, and they see yes, we are planetary, so let's become even more planetary that we become the managers of this planet. And Edward Wilson has a book called Half Earth, where he makes a proposition which in the language in which he puts it would seem very unpractical, where he says we should withdraw and leave half of the surface of the planet to other forms of life. Now, but he has some very practical propositions, and which I think are already being implemented in several parts of the world. So he says that the world has 147 or however many national parks. And he said, if we could restore all of these national parks to their pre-human ecology, before human beings intervened, with human beings often took the capstone species out, whether of a tree or a life form. He said, then we will actually produce 150 or 147 biodiversity hotspots, like in the DMZ between the two Koreas, which has become. but philosophically, I incline more towards Wilson's position, which is saying politics may be provincially and parochially human, but politics can be informed by a perspective that decenters the human. That's why in the book, I think of the book as contributing to what I call a philosophical anthropology, because I think we need to conceptualize our position in the order of things differently, and become political from and allow our politics to be informed by that perspective. So that's how I would. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for that question.
Thanks.
Thank you. Well, some of what I wanted to ask you has already been asked, so I'm going to try to make up a new question. I'll improvise. One of the things that I was thinking as you were speaking was precisely about how, these three histories, the history of the Earth system, the history of life, and the history of capitalism, they all they get decentered, right, in the face of what you're calling the planetary. But in a sense, they're not the only things that decenter human agency. And what I'm really talking about is the religion as a social force, right? Because that decenters something of human agency. So, and I was thinking that not just religion, but one of the things that the COVID epidemic brought about, the pandemic brought about, was it came to show how much there's denialism. Like, people simply don't believe in science. People actually believe that the Earth is flat. So in the middle of such an emergency, we have to deal with that additional problem, right, in the realm of politics, of men. So I'd like to hear from you about these different ways of decentering the human. And it's like the humanity gets sort of split in two, right? We believe increasingly more in science, and we have people who maybe decenter, humanity from, the universe, but it's not exactly a scientific way of reasoning. So I'd like to hear how we work out politics in the middle of all of this.
Yeah. So, first of all, I have to say, and I'm sure you'll agree that I think it would be it would not be a view based on historical evidence if we assume that all humans can never agree on one solution. So politics is based on difference. Even if it's not based on friend-enemy distinction, it's based on difference, and on disagreement. And politics is the art of what you do with disagreement. Do you go to war? Do you deal with it differently? That's eventually politics is about the exchanges you can make across differences. That's how you make a community. So the pandemic is a very interesting case in point, because first of all, it is caused, one of its major causes is the same, is connected to other environmental problems, which is destruction of forests. So even Anthony Fauci, the man who was advising Trump and then Biden, in his academic writings, he has been saying, even in the last few years, that we have entered an era of pandemics, when pandemics can happen with more frequency, because for developmental purposes, we are destroying forests. And making it possible for wildlife to come close to humans. So normally wild animals don't seek humans out. But if we destroy their habitat, they come close to us, or if we eat exotic food and stuff. And even other people have, for instance, studied chimps in Africa and found that when you build a road through the jungle, even groups of chimpanzees that previously were mixing and producing baby chimps get separated, and the gene pool becomes restricted. So they become more vulnerable to new diseases. And if you eat their meat, you get diseases from them. But it's very clear, you see, on the one hand, that the story of this pandemic is a story of evolution of a form of life called the coronavirus, which has lived in guts of bats for many years. Bats have lived for 50 million years. So on the one hand, you have an evolutionary history, a form of life is evolving using our bodies as an evolutionary pathway. On the other hand, you see the human fatigue in dealing with the pandemic. I mean, whether I look at America or I'm now in Australia, I mean, most people don't wear masks. Most people act like the pandemic is gone. And the fact that most people dying in Australia are old people, most of them. I mean, I got COVID recently and it's left me with asthma. I'm kind of old enough and have comorbidities, so I suffered. I suffered badly. But it also makes me realize it has something to do with history of demography, families. If in India, most people live with their parents. So you can't forget old people. You know, if you're careful, you kind of think, if I catch the virus, go back home, I might kill my mother. Whereas here, most people don't live with their parents. Really old parents who are in old age homes, who are separated off. So they're not at the front of their minds, right? They think, oh, it's nothing, it's a common cold, it'll suffer for 2 days. But there's clearly, the pandemic is fascinating. It shows, takes us back to the first point I was making, that humans can't produce a united response to something that is obviously hurting humans. It's hurting our economies, but we can't produce a united response to it on time. Forget climate change, which is a much more complicated problem. Right? And so I think the pandemic is a fascinating instance of the problems, but at least, you know, people who write about antibiotics make this point, that everything you throw at bacteria to prevent them from killing us, that very technology becomes an evolutionary pathway. So it is precisely because we could develop antibiotics that you have antibiotic resistant bacteria. Without antibiotics, those bacteria would not have evolved. So, and people don't remember this, the majority form of life on the planet, the majority forms are microbial. They are not animals or insects. Even insects you can see. And again, so therefore, the microbial part of the history of life would not have been known by humans before the invention of microscope. So there's something that knowledge we owe to modernity and modern technology, right? And we have that knowledge even from science. I mean, if you read people who write about the history of infectious diseases, it's clear that we live in a connected world. If there was no connection between my body and a rat's body, how do you try out a medicine on rats? Why would you? But at the same time, there's this human phenomenology, human short-termism. We see the separation. All I'm saying is that we should at least use this knowledge to develop strategies. And clearly we are failing. We're depending more and more. So now there's argument about the development of a nasal vaccine, which will be variant independent. Now that's our utopia, but nobody says we should actually stop destroying forests to the degree that we're doing. We should withdraw, as Edward Wilson was saying, and think imaginatively about forms of withdrawal, which allows human beings to flourish, to have justice between human beings, but also allow biodiversity to continue without harming us.
Okay, does anyone here have any more questions, or can I move on to our, thank you so much. Or can I move on to the students' questions? Okay, beginning with the students out in Berlin. Okay, the first one is, before climate change was unnoticed, scientists distinguished natural history and human ones, but then major changes resulted in climate change on the one hand, and now we live in the Anthropocene. As you quoted in your book, quote, global politics will not solve global warming because most societies are unable to do so, I guess, because of the very short-term nature of politics. It's a similar question, right? Can agencies solve the problem before the human species goes extinct with the planet, while climate change urges us to collectivity? And the second question, so you can answer them both together, I guess, from the ones in Berlin. Technology is the main cause for the development of the current size of the world population and for pollution. Meanwhile, technology has also become a cause for the decrease of population in Western societies. Do you think it could be a key answer to global warming? Or do you agree that technology is at the same time a cause and a solution against rapid climate change? Do you think there's anything such a solution at all?
Okay, thank you. So to the first question, I would say that human agency is not something that stays the same in the face of an unfolding crisis. So, I actually draw hope from the fact that humans are a species that learns. It doesn't mean that there will not be suffering. There's already suffering. I mean, if you're a poor person living on the coastal areas of India, particularly if you're a woman, it's a gendered problem. You don't get fresh water to cook with because the water has become salty. The seas has moved inland. So you have to go further to get fresh water. I mean, so in some ways, the climate reality is present in the lives of poor people in those areas, much more than it is in the lives of richer people. But as things happen, I mean, Australia has just gone through an election, and one of the demands was action on climate change, mainly because they saw horrible, horrible fires in 2020-21, which was followed by horrible, horrible floods. And even people who had suffered from previous floods and who had then elevated their houses to escape the expected flood level, did not escape the floods because the floods were higher. All these experiences have made climate change into a political issue. And this was one of the issues on which the previous government lost. So most recently what has happened is fascinating. What has happened is the electricity costs have gone up all the states except in the Capital Territory, because 10 years ago, Australian Capital Territory, which is a small territory, made a decision to become completely renewable. And the rates are falling. So all of these experiences will push people. So I would say human agency is not static. So we don't have to assume that humans in 20 years or 30 years will think the same way as humans today. Because they will have 30 years of bad experience, they'll have 30 years of suffering. They'll learn something from that. It's a learning, and it's a species that learns. And so we don't have to be completely hopeless, but it's not like humans will come together one day and solve the problems. And that goes to the second question as well, that technology is a fascinating part of the equation. I totally agree that technology has been at the root of some of the problems we have, but it is also at the root of human flourishing. And if you look at purely statistics of human flourishing, there's a Harvard psychologist, Pinker, right? Steve Pinker, I think is his name, who writes about how well humans are living and the fact that we've never lived so well in our past. So actually, if you look at the not the quality of life, but the standard of life, standard of living, consumption figures, violence in parts of the world. You know, I belong to a group of people not just in India, but in many other countries, probably not the majority of countries, but at least significant number of countries who have not seen a major war in their lifetime. And you know, I realize when I watch and read stories about Ukraine, that my life, I've got so many illnesses, my life is so dependent on medication that the condition for my living is peace. If I was part of a wartime country and I had to go and live in a bunker, I would die. The war would kill me simply because my life could not be sustained. So the precondition for sustaining so many human beings through technology is peace. So technology has played that role. Technology has also played a role in the destruction of other species, partly because technology grows at a very fast rate compared to evolutionary changes. So you know, Harari, the Israeli historian, argues this nicely, though others have argued it too, that you know, when lions became big hunters, they evolved to be big hunters. In the same time, deer became good runners. So many deer would escape the lion. That's how evolutionary checks and balances remain. But when you create a fishing trawler that will catch a large number of fish in the deep seas, the fishing trawler it's not something that has happened on evolutionary timescale. If it took us millions of years to produce a fishing trawler, then the fish would have also learned how to avoid the trawlers. So what happens is we take all these other creatures by surprise, because technology does not give them the time in which to learn about the dangers of our technology. And that's what produces an imbalance in between species, because species have to, I mean, species are they live on eating other species. There's no other way life can sustain itself. But the question is, what has tipped the balance in too much in favor of humans is technology. So yes, it is both part of the solution and part of the problem. And see, it would be natural for privileged human beings to desire a transition in which they keep their privileges. So somebody who owns a car would want to imagine the same lifestyle with an electric car. And so when I listen to Australian friends who are driving electric cars, their complaint is about how far you have to go. You can go. Are there enough charging stations? Hasn't Europe got more charging stations? So when they visit Paris or Berlin, they see more charging stations. So, but you see, behind that question is the idea that I should be able to go to the coast. I should be able to go on a long drive, right? And I'm not blaming them. I'm saying that humans want the life they like to continue, but also transition to a climate-friendly world. And the two may not always go together, but our desire is that the technology will help us to sort of put the two together. But whether that will work or not is a different question.
Thank you so much. Well, since we're running short on time, I'm going to try to put together the questions from our students here in Rio and the questions from the Q&A so that you can,
Sure.
answer as you wish.
Sure.
So the first question was very similar to mine on COVID. So I'm going to skip to the second one here. That is, actually, I'm going to begin with the more theoretical question here. That comes from our student Danielle. Could you give more examples on how to read a universal negative history from a planetary and subaltern perspectives? That's the first question.
Good question. It's a very subaltern history question, actually.
Of course, we all wanted to hear something about subaltern studies. The second question is, speaking in terms of species, how do you see the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on the dominant species in the Anthropocene epoch? And we have a couple of questions here in the Q&A. The first one is, how would you define the idea of Earth ethic? And how do you relate it to the feminist idea of care? Mariana, another Mariana who asked this question, she thinks that the concept of Earth care offers points of connection. Is it something that you've considered with the feminist idea of care? And in relation to the question of ethics, how do you see the scale of ethics? Should there be something like a planetary ethic, or rather specific to territories, nations, and communities? And the final question we're going to place to you is, I was wondering if we could talk about a more ontological flattening and post-humanism concepts and how it fits to today's topic. Elif, who's asking the question, says that she's just amazed about how these concepts have not come up in the discussion yet. So ontological flattening and post-humanism, feminist idea of care, and subaltern studies, basically. That's
so
almost the entire world.
Okay, yeah, I know. And so if I forget any question, kindly remind me. So on the negative universal history, the way that Adorno thought about it was that it was basically, he thought about it because he was skeptical of universal histories. So he thought universal histories actually become ruses for domination. So I say, look, we're universal, but I use the universal actually as my excuse for dominating you, which is the history of colonial rule. So when he defined negative universal history, he was imagining a history in which we come together, but I don't have to become like you in order to be together. So think of it conceptually. The question comes up with regard to environment. Does the non-human, whether living or non-living, does the non-human have to be anthropomorphized to some degree in order to give it a voice or a right or a standing? So when we say a tree or a rock should have a right, or a river should have a right, we invest the river, we create spokespeople for the river, and they express the harm we are doing to the river in the same way that you would understand the harm you might do to another human being. So a negative universal history would be where a polar bear would not have to communicate in a human language to express his or her problems, and therefore a negative universal history is very difficult to imagine given the limited nature of interspecies communication, and given that most life forms inhabiting this planet are microbial. So sometimes you can think of giving rights to trees and rocks. I mean, what do you do with microbes? And they're inside us. So that's why when I use negative universal history, and I have a little note on negative universal history in the book, but when I first used it, I was using it to mainly communicate the point which didn't get communicated to some, that when I was thinking about marrying the history of capital to history of species, my species was not a positive universal that somebody could use as a ruse for domination. So which is why the critique that I got, that species is blaming everybody, was actually a misunderstanding of what I was saying, and that's why I'd put negative universal history there. But people didn't take the cue. They didn't see the connection between my use of the word species and my use of Adorno's expression negative universal, because the negative universal is not a universal that one can use for domination. So in that sense, there's a kind of subaltern studies proposition there, that we can come together only by making room for differences. So togetherness is not about submerging differences. That's how it's conceptually using negative universal history. Now, there was another question that is not in the Q&A, the next one. Sorry, Mariana, you're muted.
I'm sorry. The second one had to do with the species. So how do you see the impact of the pandemic on the dominant species in the Anthropocene?
See, if by dominant species you mean humans, actually what's dominant is a complex of technology, humans, and other species that depend on humans. Depending on human is not always a good thing. Like we have many more cows than we would have naturally because we want to eat them, milk them. So we've industrialized cows, for instance. But cows that are milked and sold as meat, I mean, don't necessarily have good lives, even though their numbers are dependent on our needs. But let's say the dominant species is humans. And it's very interesting to see the impact of the pandemic on the humans. Well, if you listen to Bill Gates as a representative human, then he is saying we should prepare for the next pandemic. So what I see on the part of the elite is a complete reluctance to add the main causes of the frequency of pandemics, which is destruction of forest, environmental disruption. When you read people like Anthony Fauci, there's a paper by Anthony Fauci and his colleague David Morans in a biology journal that came out in 2020, and they're very clear. They say humans are the cause of pandemics. But that's the message that we don't want to take. We want to go the path of creating more vaccinations, creating more technology, giving. There's a virologist called Nathan Wolfe, who was a professor at Stanford and then set himself up as a consultant virologist with independent research. And so he has a book called The Viral Storm. And his argument is that, it goes back to some of the discussion we were having before. His argument is that to fight pandemics, we should give more power to WHO to actually override nation states, because we should have commando-like groups that at the first information received about any possible breakout of a pandemic, goes there and isolate that group of people. It's very interesting. How will you get first information? Suppose something breaks out in a remote village in Africa. So his proposition is that give everybody a cell phone. And the place where the outbreak of a disease will show up is on cell phone chatter. And we should be monitoring cell phone chatter throughout the world to get early signs of the breakout of a pandemic. Now, but but nobody is saying, don't cut down so many trees. Let wildlife be. So instead of, as I said, that there are two ways to go. One is to withdraw. If our overexpansion is causing problems, withdraw, which is what Edward Wilson is saying. All other solutions are doing more of the same, right? And keeping more technology. And this is not necessarily most viruses and bacteria that we know affect humans, we don't have treatments for. The common cold is something we don't have treatments for. I mean, you try to do the flu vaccine, but if you get it, doctors will say, look, just sit it out. And they play also very important role in the history of life, in the history of our emotions. I mean, sometimes bacteria and viruses produce the chemicals we need to feel the feelings we like. So we are totally immersed in them. But so the lesson of the pandemic is, for me, is that yes, humans are learners. They learn from experience, but they don't learn immediately. We're a little bit slow. Very bright, but very slow. So I'll go to the two questions in Q&A.
Yeah. Oh, you have access to them, of course.
Yeah, I can see them. Yes, actually, the idea of earth ethic feminism. There is, I know the book, it's actually in my book, but the name escapes me. There is actually a book on, and it may very well be called Earth Ethic. Because Arendt used to talk about earth ethics. So, so it's probably deeply connected to the question of care. So, but I mean, I don't see any contradiction between the concept of care and earth ethic and what Edward Wilson is saying, withdraw. The principle is the same. And I use the word reverence, following a geologist in my book, but reverence in the sense that the earth is both marvelous in this, for us humans, we are almost programmed to find it marvelous and beautiful because we are part of the explosion of multicellular life. And when you look at the history of multicellular life, to us, evolution would seem marvelous. It's amazing to see the designs of creatures and things. So you can go the religious path, but even as a secular person, it affects you spiritually when you think about it. So the earth is beautiful, but it's also awesome, and it's awesome in its capacity to destroy our lives. It's so, and that's why the idea of reverence, where you actually feel both respect and fear. And fear was a very important part of interspecies regulation of life, which is why most animals can bluff, can do something to give you the signal that they want you to fear them. And basically the history of technology is that we called their bluff. So we collectively, like individually, I'd be scared of a fox. But I'll try to build a city where fox is not my next door neighbor, though that's changing for London and Berlin and other places where foxes are becoming urban animals. But in India, for instance, because of their loss of habitat, leopards are trying to be urban animals. And they've discovered that street dogs are harder to eat because they work in gangs. But domestic dogs are a better prey, both better fed and isolated animals. And people in the outskirts of Bombay and Mumbai are trying to cope with this problem. But because we still fear the leopard. So the idea of building a city is that the city should be free of wild animals, which is something I discussed in the last chapter of the book, that even when Hobbes thought of political order, he assumed that wild animals would not be part of it, that they would belong to the state of nature, right? So human beings need this safety, but the best way of getting this safety is to make sure that they have their spaces, because they don't seek humans out, because they know that humans are dangerous in numbers. A single human is not dangerous, but humans are dangerous because we can collaborate, we are intelligent, we create technology, we can kill them through our cooperation and technology. So that's why I use the word reverence. But whether you think through reverence or whether you think through Hannah Arendt's earth ethic, there's a question about absolutely about how do you care for other forms of life. And so yeah, I agree with the spirit of the question. And the last question was about the post-humanism, ontological flattening. So I do think that certain amount of ontological flattening happens in some post-human approaches or in some new materialistic approaches. I mean, I learn a lot from post-humanism and from new materialism, but at the end of the day, as I was saying before, that I make room for human phenomenology and therefore for human ontology, and therefore I probably would resist the flattening aspect of it.
There we go. So thank you so much for these answers to all these questions. Oh, Sergio has one more.
I don't know if there is space for a final
Sure.
question, because it's something that is really intriguing me. Is still the connection between Earth ethics and also politics and agency? Because if you look at again, to this history of the two histories, the history of global capitalism and the planet's history. If you look at the history of global capitalism, it's more or less easy to construct a critical perspective based on the pair equality, inequality. This has been also the way how you also have dealt with this sort of critique of capitalism. But if you look at the planet's history, I couldn't find the book, at least in a simple way, to phrase this sort of perspective you construct to have a critical perspective on the planetary history. I don't know if the question is clear.
No, no, it's interesting. So,
and perhaps just to add one small point, because of course the idea of equality and inequality you cannot apply to planetary ethics, because of course the sort of interdependencies between the different living beings has nothing to do with equality and inequality. So you are involved in food chains and so on. The idea of equality is simply not valid in this sort of register. So,
yeah. No, that's a very interesting question and a relevant question. And I think you're right in saying I don't pick it up in the book about whether, even the question, whether one can have a more critical planetary history as distinct from planetary history. See, for me, I'll come back to the critical question about being critical. For me, what I got out of my studies about system science, evolution, etc., is an appreciation of how much deep history runs through us and how much we forget deep history in thinking about human history, whether it's war, politics, teaching. So now today I can say to a student, look, your body was born with you. It will die with you. But it took millions of years to design it. You know? And so, I mean, deep history we are products of deep history in that sense. So an appreciation of deep history. So that's why I can say that, look, the human body and the body of a mouse or body of any mammal are connected bodies. Normally when the doctor, and that's why you see it pretty clearly in medicine, in trials of medicine. Why would you try them out on monkeys and rats if we didn't have something in common? And that dotted line relationship is about evolution, is about the designing of bodies. So in that sense, I've become much more aware of how deep history runs through us, through everything. And the history of medicine is about the history of illness is about history of deep history. It's about history of evolution, whether it's genetics or whether it's even beyond that. So that way, and I talk about that in the book, the falling into deep history, that kind of Heideggerian sense of falling, being thrown into deep history by the crisis. But as a historian, it was always taken as the background, something you didn't need to know about, scientists might need to know about. But coming to the important part of your question, can we have a critical planetary history? My answer, and it's a provisional answer, would be no. Because the word critical has such a genealogy in intrahuman history. Because it is about the hermeneutics of suspicion. That's where it's coming from. And it's very powerful in thinking about equality, inequality, oppression, all of those things. So that's why I remember when I was teaching in Melbourne University, we had to think about how to sell humanities students to the government, to business. And we used to say, we give them skills of critical skills. And the dean would say, no, critical is a bad word. Give them analytical skills. Because analysis was more neutral than critical. Critical was almost political. So the problem is, if the moment you have a political view of the planet, you fold it back into human history, because planetary history entails things that happened when no humans were here. How do you have a critical view of the oxidation, the history of the Great Oxidation, 2.5 billion years ago? So this history, see, the reason why planetary history, deep history is important, it tells us, it provincializes human history in that sense. It tells you what is parochially human. And our provincial history requires criticality. Because we are, I think of humans as not as a just animal. We do not give justice, but we seek justice. So we are always interested in seeking justice, but we give it very seldom. Like when we're in a position to be just, we end up being mostly unjust. So in that sense, I'm more kind of, justice for me is, in a Derridian sense, always to come. And that's the function of being critical, is to think of it in a Derridian Levinasian way. It is always to come. So that would be my answer to your very interesting question, which I don't think the book addresses directly, but I'm actually just finishing a short book called One Planet, Many Worlds, and I will probably take up this question. Thank you for it.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I hope that we can invite you over to discuss your new book when it comes out too, because it has been really wonderful to listen to you this afternoon. I think I can speak for all of us here, and certainly for all of my students here in the classroom. And so, I mean, just thank you so much for everything.
Thank you for inviting me. This was also very early in the morning, but was very enjoyable.
Well, I hope you have a nice day after this, because we're going to be thinking about this all through the night.
Right. Wish me a nice sleep.
I will. I wish you the sleep of the just, right? And next week we have Sarah Stevano here speaking on inequalities before and after the pandemic, right? Economic inequalities before and after the pandemic. Once again, Dipesh, thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. If
That's great.
Call you all by first names. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah.